In a city shrouded by secrets, a homeless teen stumbles upon the truth behind a wealthy recluse's tragic past. As they unravel the mystery together, an unlikely bond forms, transforming their lives in ways neither imagined. But can love and redemption truly heal wounds buried so deep? Mia had never known a life of comfort. The streets had been her home since her mother disappeared when she was just 10 years old, leaving her to fend for herself in a world that cared little for a girl with no one to protect her. At 15, Mia had already developed a steely resolve, a necessity born out of countless nights spent in alleyways, clutching a worn blanket as her only shield against the cold. She had learned to be tough, to rely on her wits, and to trust no one. But beneath the grit and determination, there was a glimmer of something more, a yearning for a different life, one where she didn't have to fight for every scrap of food or sleep with one eye open. On a particularly gray afternoon, hunger gnawed at her insides, a familiar companion that wouldn't be ignored. She wandered into one of the wealthier parts of the city, where the houses were grand and the sidewalks pristine, hoping to find something edible in the bins behind the stately mansions. This was a risky move, she knew. People in these parts didn't take kindly to strangers rummaging through their trash, but desperation pushed her forward. As she sifted through the contents of a bin, her fingers brushed against something solid, tucked beneath a pile of discarded food containers. Curiosity piqued, she dug deeper, pulling out what appeared to be a weathered leather-bound chest, small enough to fit in her arms. It was heavy, the kind of weight that suggested value. She glanced around, half expecting someone to come rushing out of the mansion to reclaim it, but the street remained eerily quiet. Mia quickly made her way to a nearby alley, her heart pounding with the thrill of discovery. She knelt on the damp pavement and pried open the chest's latch. Inside, nestled among velvet lining, were a stack of documents, yellowed with age, but meticulously organized. She flipped through them, her eyes widening as she caught the name Henry Donovan scrawled across several pages in bold, authoritative handwriting. She knew that name, everyone in the city did. Henry Donovan was a reclusive millionaire, a man of immense wealth who had withdrawn from public life after a tragic fire had claimed the lives of his wife and children a decade ago. The details of the fire were shrouded in mystery, with rumors and speculation filling the gaps left by the media's limited coverage. Mia's heart raced as she read through the documents, her breath catching when she realized what she was holding. The papers detailed not just the family's wealth, but also hinted at dark secrets, suggesting that Henry might have been involved in the fire that killed his family. Her mind whirled with possibilities. If these documents were as valuable as they seemed, they could be her ticket out of this wretched life. The streets had taught her that knowledge was power, and in this chest, she held something that could change everything. But she also knew that such a move would be dangerous. Confronting a man like Henry Donovan could backfire spectacularly. Yet, the thought of finally escaping her life of hardship was too tempting to ignore. Mia stood at the iron gates of Henry Donovan's mansion, her pulse quickening as she surveyed the imposing structure before her. The mansion loomed over the manicured lawn like a relic from another time, its grandeur marred by an air of neglect. Vines crept along the stone walls, and the windows, though pristine, seemed to reflect a sadness that matched the somber sky above. This was a place where ghosts lingered, their presence felt in every shadow. Slipping through a gap in the gate, Mia moved silently, her eyes scanning for any sign of life. The house had a stillness to it, a silence so complete it made her feel as though she had stepped into another world. Her footsteps were soundless on the gravel path as she approached the side entrance, the one she'd seen the servants use on rare occasions. The door was locked, but Mia had learned long ago how to deal with locks. A few minutes later, she was inside. The interior was as grand as she'd imagined, but it was also cold, devoid of the warmth that usually accompanied such wealth. She moved through the house with purpose, her small frame almost swallowed by the vastness of the hallways. She knew where she was going, toward the room at the end of the West Wing, where she'd heard from the streets Henry Donovan spent most of his time. When she reached the door, she paused, gathering her courage. Her hand tightened around the chest she carried, the weight of it both a comfort and a burden. This was it. She took a deep breath and pushed open the door. Henry Donovan looked up from his desk, his eyes narrowing in confusion as he took in the sight of the young girl standing before him. He was not the man she'd imagined. There was no trace of the formidable figure the city had whispered about. Instead, she saw a man worn down by time and grief, his face lined with the pain of a past that refused to stay buried. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Mia's heart hammered in her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. She wasn't here to beg, she was here to make a demand. "I have something that belongs to you," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. She placed the chest on the desk, pushing it toward him. "I'll give it back if you agree to adopt me." Henry blinked, the shock evident in his eyes as he looked from the chest to Mia and back again. He seemed to be processing her words, his mind slow to catch up with the boldness of her proposition. Finally, he reached out and opened the chest, his expression changing as he rifled through the documents inside. The papers stirred something deep within him, and Mia could see it, the pain, the memories, the guilt that surfaced as he recognized the contents. His hand trembled slightly as he pulled out a photograph of his late wife and children, and for a moment, Mia thought he might crumble under the weight of it all. But he didn't. Instead, he looked up at her, his gaze piercing. "You think you can blackmail me with this?" he asked, his voice low and measured, though it held an undercurrent of something she couldn't quite identify. "I think," Mia replied, meeting his gaze without flinching, "that you're a man who understands loss. And I think you might want a chance to help someone who's been through more than you realize. I don't want money, I want a life. And you can give me that." Henry stared at her for a long time, his eyes searching hers. She could feel him weighing her words, the proposition she had laid before him as audacious as it was desperate. For a moment, she thought she had him, that he might agree simply out of shock. But then, the flicker of hope she'd felt began to fade as his expression softened, not with acquiescence, but with something far more devastating, pity. He sighed deeply, setting the documents down with a tenderness that belied the pain they caused him. "You're wrong about one thing, Mia," he said, his voice now tinged with sorrow. "I'm not the monster these papers suggest. I didn't cause that fire. But I've carried the guilt of it for years, knowing that others might believe I did." Mia's heart sank. She could see it now, her plan unraveling before her eyes. She had gambled on this man's guilt, on his fear of exposure, but she had misjudged him. The strength she had found in the possibility of a new life slipped away, leaving her feeling small and foolish. Seeing the defeat in her eyes, Henry's expression softened further. "I don't need to be blackmailed to help someone like you," he said quietly. "But I won't be coerced into anything, either." Mia swallowed the lump in her throat, nodding as she realized she had no leverage left. The chest, the documents, they meant nothing now. She had gambled everything on this one chance, and she had lost. Without another word, she turned to leave, the weight of her failure pressing down on her like a leaden cloak. But as she reached the door, Henry's voice stopped her. "Mia." She turned back, meeting his gaze once more. "I admire your courage," he said, and there was no mistaking the sincerity in his tone. "You want a different life, and I can understand that. But this isn't the way." She nodded again, her throat too tight to speak. Then, without another word, she slipped out of the mansion the same way she had entered, the documents left behind on Henry's desk. The mansion was silent once more, but the air was heavy with memories that stirred as Henry Donovan sat alone in his study, the chest Mia had brought him now open on his desk. The documents lay spread out before him like ghosts of a past he had tried for years to bury. He hadn't touched these papers since the night they were locked away, yet here they were, resurfacing just as the wounds they inflicted had started to scab over. Henry reached for a photograph, his hand trembling slightly as he held it up to the dim light of the desk lamp. It was of his wife, Lily, and their 2 children, taken months before the fire. Lily's smile was radiant, the children's faces bright with joy, captured in a moment of pure happiness. It was a moment that now seemed almost unreal, a cruel reminder of all he had lost. His eyes lingered on the photo before setting it down gently, as though handling something fragile. He turned his attention to the papers, his heart heavy with the familiar ache that surfaced whenever he thought about that night. He began to sift through the documents, the contents of the chest revealing themselves slowly, as though the truth within them had to be coaxed out. These were not the official reports he had seen during the investigation, but personal notes, scribbled observations, and photographs. They were unmistakably the work of his late mother-in-law, Margaret, a woman of fierce intelligence and an unrelenting sense of duty to her family. Margaret had never been the same after the fire. Her grief had turned inward, twisting into something dark and corrosive. She had suspected him, he had seen it in her eyes even when she had never said it outright. Now, as he read through her notes, it became clear just how deep those suspicions had run. There were references to conversations she had had with the fire investigators, snippets of overheard gossip, and pages filled with her musings, all pointing to the possibility that Henry had been involved in the tragedy. But as he read, a nagging doubt began to form in his mind. The Margaret he knew was sharp, logical, almost ruthless in her pursuit of the truth. Yet, these notes were disjointed, sometimes contradictory, as if she had been grasping at straws, trying to make sense of a reality that defied reason. Her pain was evident in every word, her grief clouding her judgment, turning her suspicions into something obsessive. Henry's chest tightened as he came across a particularly damning piece of evidence, a note detailing a conversation with one of the fire marshals. Margaret had written that the fire marshal had mentioned a possible accelerant found in the remains of the house, something that could suggest foul play. But there was a hesitation in her words, a question mark hovering over her conclusion. It was as though she had wanted to believe it, but couldn't quite bring herself to accept it fully. He set the note aside, feeling the weight of it pressing down on him. He remembered the night of the fire with painful clarity, the heat, the smoke, the desperate screams that still echoed in his mind. He had been away on a business trip, a fact that had saved his life, but also marked him as a suspect in the eyes of some, especially Margaret. He had always believed the fire was a tragic accident, but seeing these documents, he couldn't help but revisit the doubt that had plagued him in the early days of the investigation. As he continued to read, another detail caught his attention. Margaret had kept photographs, images of the charred remains of the house, the rooms where her daughter and grandchildren had perished. But there was something off about them, something that tugged at the edges of Henry's memory. He studied them closely, his eyes narrowing as he noticed small inconsistencies. The placement of furniture, the angle of the photographs, it was as if something had been altered or misrepresented, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. The realization crept up on him slowly, like a cold draft seeping through a crack in a window. Margaret had been convinced of his guilt, but her investigation had been flawed, driven by grief and a need to find someone to blame. And yet, there were pieces missing, fragments of the story that didn't add up. The fire marshal's report had been inconclusive, and the accelerant theory had never been substantiated. Had Margaret been misled? Or had she, in her desperation, twisted the facts to fit her narrative? Henry leaned back in his chair, the weight of these revelations pressing down on him. He had spent years trying to move past the tragedy, to live with the knowledge that his family was gone and nothing could bring them back. But now, with these documents laid out before him, he felt the old wounds reopening, the grief as raw as it had been on that fateful night. There were still questions that needed answers, and the more he delved into Margaret's notes, the more he realized that the truth might be far more complicated than he had ever imagined. His mother-in-law had been a woman of many strengths, but even she had been fallible. Had she let her emotions cloud her judgment, leading her down a path of false accusations? Or was there something more sinister at play, something that had been missed all those years ago? Henry Donovan had spent days in the solitude of his mansion, the haunting revelations from the chest gnawing at his peace. The questions that had surfaced left him restless, unable to shake the feeling that the truth had always been just out of reach. And then there was Mia, the girl who had burst into his life like a gust of wind, with her audacious demands and desperate eyes. She had been the catalyst, forcing him to confront the past he had tried to forget. Tracking her down wasn't easy. Mia was a creature of the streets, slipping through the cracks of the city, blending into the shadows with the ease of someone who had long ago learned to survive by staying invisible. But Henry was a man with resources, and determination born of a need for answers. He knew the city, knew its hidden corners and whispered secrets, and with the right connections, he finally found her. It was in a rundown diner, tucked away in a part of the city where people came to disappear. The place smelled of greasy food and stale coffee, and the air buzzed with the low hum of conversation. Mia was hunched over a cup of coffee, her face drawn, her eyes distant as she stared out the smudged window. She looked smaller than he remembered, her fierce determination tempered by a weariness that belied her age. Henry slid into the booth across from her without a word, watching as she startled, her eyes snapping to his with a mixture of surprise and wariness. She tensed, ready to flee, but he held up a hand, his expression calm. "Don't go," he said quietly. "I'm not here to cause trouble." Mia's eyes narrowed, suspicion flickering in their depths. "Then why are you here?" "Because I need your help," he replied, leaning forward slightly, his voice earnest. "And I think you need mine." She stared at him for a long moment, the silence between them heavy with unspoken words. She was good at reading people, she had to be to survive, and she saw something in his eyes that made her pause. He wasn't just another wealthy man trying to manipulate her. There was something genuine in his request, something that spoke to the part of her that had always yearned for more than the life she had been given. "You need my help?" she repeated, her tone laced with skepticism. "With what?" Henry took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "You were right about one thing when you came to see me. There are things in my past that don't add up, things I've ignored for too long. I've gone through the documents you brought me, and they've raised more questions than they've answered. I think there's a truth buried in them, something I need to find out. But I can't do it alone." Mia studied him, her mind racing. This was not what she had expected. She had thought she'd be running from him, or worse, that he'd have her arrested for trespassing. But instead, here he was, asking for her help. It didn't make sense, and that made her uneasy. "And what do I get out of this?" she asked, crossing her arms, her gaze challenging. "A chance at a new life," Henry said simply. "You want stability, a future, something different from what you've known. I can give you that. But I need you to help me first. I need someone who knows how to move through the city, someone who can see things from a different perspective. I need someone like you." Mia's heart pounded as she weighed his words. She had always been on her own, relying on no one but herself. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. But the offer he was making was tempting, more than tempting. It was everything she had dreamed of, but had never believed she could have. "You want me to help you dig into your past?" she asked, her voice softer now, curiosity creeping in despite herself. Henry nodded. I want to find out what really happened to my family. I need to know if there's more to the story than what I've been told. And I think you can help me do that." She chewed on her lip, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. It was a risk, she knew that. But it was also an opportunity, one she might never get again. And something in Henry's eyes told her he was sincere. This was a man who had lost everything, and he was reaching out to her, offering a lifeline that could pull them both out of the darkness. Finally, she nodded. "All right," she said, her voice steady. "I'll help you. But I'm not making any promises. If I don't like what I find, I'm out." "That's fair," Henry agreed, relief washing over him. "But if we do this, we do it together. We'll get to the bottom of it, whatever it takes." The two of them sat in that dingy diner, a strange alliance forming between them, one built on mutual need and a shared desire for answers. Henry brought the resources, the connections, and the experience, while Mia brought her street smarts, her instincts, and the courage born of a life that had never been easy. The morning sun cast long shadows across the city streets as Mia and Henry emerged from the archives, their faces etched with a mix of exhaustion and determination. They had spent the better part of the night poring over dusty files and forgotten records, each piece of information bringing them one step closer to the truth that had eluded Henry for so many years. Mia tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, her eyes scanning the notes she had meticulously compiled. "So, your mother-in-law had a lot more going on than anyone knew," she remarked, her voice thoughtful. Henry nodded, his gaze distant as he processed the revelations. "Margaret was always protective, sometimes to a fault. But I never imagined she'd go to such lengths." They walked in silence for a moment, the sounds of the bustling city fading into the background as they contemplated their next move. The trail they were following had led them to unexpected places, unearthing secrets that had been buried beneath layers of pain and deception. "Next stop is the old neighborhood," Mia said, breaking the silence. "There's a few people still around who might remember something useful." Henry hesitated, the prospect of returning to the place where his life had shattered filling him with unease. But he knew it was necessary. "All right," he agreed, his voice steady. "Let's see what we can find." The old neighborhood had changed over the years, but the memories remained vivid. As they walked down the tree-lined street, Henry felt a pang of nostalgia mixed with sorrow. The house that had once been his home was gone, replaced by a modern structure that lacked the charm of the original. Yet, the echoes of the past lingered, tugging at his heart. They approached a modest house with a well-tended garden, the home of Mrs. Jenkins, an elderly woman who had lived on the street for decades. She greeted them warmly, her eyes lighting up with recognition when she saw Henry. "Henry Donovan, is that you?" she exclaimed, her voice quivering with emotion. "It's been so long." He smiled softly, taking her frail hand in his. "It's good to see you, Mrs. Jenkins. I was hoping you could help us with something." Over steaming cups of tea, they delved into conversation, Mia listening intently as Henry gently probed for information. Mrs. Jenkins recalled the night of the fire with tears in her eyes, recounting the chaos and heartbreak that had engulfed the community. "I always knew something wasn't right about the way people talked afterward," she said, her gaze distant. "Especially that Mr. Thompson. He was always stirring up trouble." Mia's ears perked up. "Mr. Thompson? Can you tell us more about him?" Mrs. Jenkins pursed her lips, a flicker of disdain crossing her features. "He lived across the street from you, Henry. Always envied your success, always had something negative to say. After the fire, he was quick to point fingers, mostly at you." Henry's brow furrowed. "I remember him being difficult, but I had no idea he harbored such resentment." Oh, he did, Mrs. Jenkins affirmed. And he wasn't shy about spreading rumors. Told anyone who would listen that you were responsible, that you had something to gain from losing your family. Her voice broke slightly, and she took a moment to compose herself. Mia exchanged a glance with Henry, the puzzle pieces beginning to align. Do you know what happened to him? He passed away a few years back, Mrs. Jenkins replied. Heart attack, I believe. No family left behind. They thanked her for her time and kindness, leaving the house with more clarity than when they had arrived. Back at the mansion, they spread out all the information they had gathered on the grand dining table. Documents, photographs, and handwritten notes formed a mosaic of clues that pointed toward a truth long obscured. Mia tapped a photograph of the old electrical system schematics they had found in the city archives. Look here. The wiring in your house was outdated, and there were several reports recommending immediate repairs. Henry examined the document, his jaw tightening. I never saw these reports. Because they were never submitted to you, Mia explained. They were addressed to Margaret. She must have known about the issues, but chose not to act. A heavy silence settled between them as the implications sank in. Henry ran a hand through his hair, his eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and sorrow. Why would she keep this from us? From me? Mia's voice was gentle. Maybe she was trying to save face, avoid the expense or the embarrassment. Or perhaps she thought it wasn't that serious. But when the worst happened, the guilt must have been overwhelming. Henry nodded slowly, the weight of understanding pressing down on him. And Thompson seized the opportunity to fuel her guilt, turning it into blame directed at me. Exactly, Mia confirmed. He used her vulnerability to advance his own bitterness, manipulating her grief for his twisted satisfaction. They sifted through more documents, each one corroborating their theory. Witness statements, maintenance reports, and even entries from Margaret's personal journal painted a picture of a tragedy born from negligence and exploited by malice. As the day faded into evening, the enormity of their discovery settled over them. The truth, though painful, brought a sense of closure that had been absent for too long. Mia looked at Henry, her eyes reflecting empathy and understanding. I'm sorry you had to go through all of this. But at least now you know. He met her gaze, gratitude evident in his expression. I couldn't have done this without you, Mia. You helped me find answers I didn't even know I was seeking. She offered a small smile, warmth spreading through her at his words. And you've given me something I never thought I'd have, a chance to be part of something meaningful. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the shadows lengthening around them as the sun dipped below the horizon. The past had finally been illuminated, its mysteries unraveled through their combined efforts. There was no one left to blame, no justice to seek, but there was peace and understanding. Henry rose from his chair, extending a hand to Mia. How about we get some dinner? I think we've earned it. The late autumn air was crisp as Mia stood at the gates of the mansion, her eyes lingering on the sprawling estate that had come to feel like a refuge, despite its history of sorrow. The mystery that had bound her to Henry was now resolved, leaving her with a sense of closure, and a decision that weighed heavily on her mind. The streets had taught her to be wary, to rely only on herself, but in Henry, she had found something she never expected, a place where she could belong. Mia had always been a survivor, carving out an existence on the fringes of society. But now, for the first time, she was faced with the possibility of more. The thought of returning to school, of pursuing the education she had been denied, filled her with both excitement and apprehension. It was a chance to build a future, but it also meant leaving behind the life she had known. She was deep in thought when Henry approached, his footsteps soft on the gravel. He had been watching her closely these past days, sensing the conflict within her. They had spent so much time together, and in that time, Henry had come to care for Mia in a way he hadn't anticipated. She wasn't just a reminder of what he had lost, she was a beacon of hope for what could still be. "You're thinking about leaving," Henry said, his voice gentle but certain. Mia turned to him, nodding slightly. "I am. I need to do something for myself. Going back to school feels like the right step." Henry studied her, his heart heavy with the thought of her leaving but understanding her need for independence. He had always known this day would come, yet it didn't make it any easier. "I won't stand in your way," he said finally. "But before you go, I have something I'd like to ask." Mia tilted her head, curious but guarded. "What is it?" Henry took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "I've grown very fond of you, Mia. You've brought life back into this house, into my life. I've been thinking, maybe it doesn't have to end here." She frowned slightly, not sure where he was going with this. "What do you mean?" "I mean," he continued, his voice filled with emotion, "I'd like you to consider staying. Not just as someone I've helped, but as my daughter. I want to adopt you, Mia, if you'll have me." The words hung in the air between them, and Mia felt her heart skip a beat. Of all the things she had imagined, this was the last she expected. She had spent so many years alone, fending for herself, that the idea of being part of a family, of having a father, seemed almost too good to be true. Her throat tightened, and she blinked back sudden tears. "You really mean that?" Henry smiled warmly, his eyes soft with affection. "I do. You've become like a daughter to me, and I want to be the father you never had. We could be a family, Mia. You don't have to do this alone anymore." Mia's defenses, so carefully built over the years, began to crumble. She had longed for this, for someone to care for her, to guide her. But she had never dared to believe it was possible. I don't know what to say," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Say yes," Henry urged gently. "Say yes, and let's build something new together." Mia looked into his eyes, seeing the sincerity there, the love she had always wanted but never received. Slowly, she nodded, a small, hesitant smile spreading across her face. "Yes. I'd like that." Relief and joy washed over Henry, and he pulled her into a tight embrace, holding her close as if afraid to let go. "Thank you, Mia," he murmured. "You've made me so happy." The decision made, Mia felt a sense of peace settle over her. This was the beginning of a new chapter, one where she wouldn't have to face the world alone. She would return to school, but now she had someone, to come home to. The years that followed were filled with moments of happiness and healing, as Mia and Henry settled into their new life together. Mia returned to school, throwing herself into her studies with a determination that impressed even her teachers. Henry, proud and supportive, was there for every milestone, offering guidance and wisdom as she navigated the path to adulthood. They traveled the world together, exploring places that Mia had only ever dreamed of. From the cobblestone streets of Paris to the sun-drenched beaches of Greece, they created memories that filled the void left by the loss of Henry's family. In each new place, Mia grew more confident, more assured of her place in the world, and of the bond she shared with Henry. Henry watched with pride as Mia blossomed into an accomplished young woman. She finished school with honors, then went on to college, pursuing a degree in law, something that combined her sharp mind with her desire to make a difference. Her passion for justice, born from her own experiences on the streets, drove her to excel, and she soon became known as a force to be reckoned with. Throughout it all, their relationship deepened, evolving from one of necessity to one of genuine love and respect. Henry became the father Mia had always longed for, guiding her with a steady hand and a compassionate heart. And Mia, in turn, gave Henry a sense of purpose, filling the emptiness that had haunted him since the loss of his family. Their bond was unbreakable, forged in the fires of tragedy and tempered by the love that had grown between them. And as Mia stood on the stage at her college graduation, looking out at the man who had given her a second chance at life, she knew that she had found more than just a father, she had found a home. The applause thundered around her, but Mia's eyes were fixed on Henry, who stood in the front row, his eyes shining with pride and love. This was her moment, but it was also theirs, a testament to the power of second chances and the healing that comes with unconditional love. The morning sun filtered through the curtains, casting a soft, golden glow over the room. The house was still, wrapped in a peaceful quiet that felt both comforting and heavy. Mia sat by Henry's bedside, her hand gently holding his, feeling the coolness of his skin. His breathing was shallow, each breath a little slower than the last, and she knew the time was near. Henry had lived a full life, one marked by both immense joy and profound sorrow. He had found a second chance in Mia, just as she had found one in him. And now, as he lay in the twilight of his life, Mia could see a sense of peace on his face that hadn't been there before. She leaned in closer, her voice a whisper. "I'm here, Henry," she said softly. "You're not alone." His eyes fluttered open briefly, and he gave her a faint smile, the love they shared shining in his gaze. "You've made me so proud, Mia," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "You've given me more than I ever thought possible." Tears welled in her eyes, but she held them back, wanting to stay strong for him. "You've done the same for me, Henry. I wouldn't be who I am without you." He squeezed her hand lightly, a final gesture of the bond they had formed, before his eyes drifted closed one last time. Mia sat with him until the end, the room filled with a deep, abiding love that would linger long after he was gone. When Henry passed, it was as he had lived his later years, peacefully, with grace and dignity. His death was a profound loss, a pain that settled deep in Mia's chest, but she also found solace in the memories they had created together. Henry had given her more than just his fortune, he had given her a family, a sense of belonging, and a future she had never imagined for herself. In the months following Henry's passing, Mia found herself reflecting on their journey, on the twists of fate that had brought them together. The mansion, once a place of sorrow and regret, had become a home filled with warmth and love. But as she wandered through its quiet halls, she knew she needed to do something to honor the man who had changed her life in ways she couldn't fully put into words. The idea came to her one evening as she sat in Henry's study, surrounded by the mementos of his life. She would write a memoir, a tribute to the man who had saved her, and to the mystery that had bound them together. It would be a way to share their story with the world, to reveal the truth about the tragedy that had haunted Henry for so long, and to clear his name once and for all. Mia threw herself into the project, her fingers flying over the keys as she poured out the memories, the emotions, and the truths they had uncovered together. The process was cathartic, a way to work through her grief while keeping Henry's spirit alive. She wrote of the fire, of the pain and the accusations that had followed, and of the truth they had discovered, of how it had all been a tragic accident, born from circumstances beyond anyone's control. But more than that, she wrote about Henry, the man behind the mystery. She wrote of his kindness, his quiet strength, and the love he had shown her when she had no one else. She wrote of the way he had opened his heart to her, taking in a lost girl and giving her the family she had always longed for. And she wrote of their adventures, the travels, the laughter, and the joy they had shared in the years that followed. The memoir, titled Henry's Grace, A Journey of Love and Redemption, became an instant bestseller, touching hearts around the world. Readers were moved by the story of a man who had endured so much loss, only to find hope and healing in the most unexpected of places. Through Mia's words, Henry's legacy was preserved, his name cleared, and his true nature revealed to the world. As the years passed, Mia continued to honor Henry's memory in ways that extended beyond the pages of her book. She used the fortune he had left her to establish a foundation dedicated to helping street kids, children who, like her, had been lost, abandoned, and forgotten. The foundation provided them with shelter, education, and the support they needed to build better lives for themselves, just as Henry had done for her. Mia visited the foundation regularly, spending time with the children, sharing her story, and encouraging them to believe in their own potential. She saw herself in their eyes, in their fear, their uncertainty, and their hope. And she knew that this was her true calling, the path that Henry had set her on. The mansion, once a place of solitude, now echoed with the laughter of children, with the sounds of life and hope. Mia had turned it into the heart of the foundation, a place where young lives could be transformed, where new beginnings were possible. And though Henry was gone, his presence was felt in every corner of that house, in every life Mia touched. His love and kindness lived on, not just in the pages of her book, but in the lives of those who had been given a second chance because of him. As Mia stood on the terrace one evening, watching the sunset over the gardens Henry had so lovingly tended, she felt a deep sense of peace. She had found her purpose, her place in the world, and she knew that Henry's legacy of love and kindness would continue to ripple outward, touching lives far beyond their own. She smiled softly, feeling his presence in the fading light. "Thank you, Henry," she whispered, her heart full. "For everything." And as the night descended, Mia knew that she was never truly alone. The love they had shared, the bond they had forged, would remain with her always, a guiding light as she continued the work they had begun together.